Hello, everyone. Today's podcast is another film discussion with Agnes Callard. Last time we chatted about a film called Police Adjective and tried to get to grips with that. I'm not sure we really succeeded, so we decided to beef up the team a bit, and we're going to be joined today by Abe Callard, who I should give a full nepotism alert is Agnes's son. So hello, Agnes, and hello, Abe.
Hello.
Hi.
So our idea that we came up with was to talk about two films linked by a theme. And I don't quite know how, but two films turned into three films. And despite there being three films, I didn't get to choose any of them. So none of them had I seen. So I had a ton of homework to do. But actually, thank you very much, because the three films were absolutely terrific. And I'll just say what they were. All About Eve, which is the 1950 Bette Davis film. Persona, which is a 1966 Bergman film, and Close Up, which is an Iranian docudrama. And the theme that I think, Agnes, you chose for the discussion was celebrity and the true self. So maybe we could kick off just by, in true philosophical fashion, defining the terms. And so what do we mean by celebrity and what do we mean by the true self?
Yeah, so one way to think about it is like a true self is actually just a really hard concept to get a grip on. We all want to be authentic. We want to discover our true selves. We want to express our true selves. We want to be who we really are. But those terms are kind of elusive. And it's hard for me to know, what do I mean by my true self? One way to get a grip on the idea of a true self is to think about the idea of pretense or acting, right? Where that provides a clear contrast case, right? So it's maybe when you're not acting, right, would be one way to get a grip on that thought. And so we thought that we could sort of think about the idea of the self by using acting as a kind of lens for that. And there's a couple of movies that seem to do that. But in a way, the idea of just of acting doesn't quite get you. The really strong contrast is kind of the persona that the actor inhabits, even when they're not acting, right? It's almost like the actor lives some kind of fashioned life. And that's sort of what we mean by a celebrity, right? It's like somebody whose life has a kind of outer face that is visible to other people. And that's it's a kind of public self. And so all of our movies are in a way about the kind of interface between that public self that a celebrity has and then the regular old selves that other people have, and the kind of effect on a regular person of coming into contact with that kind of celebrity self.
I think a phrase that encapsulates the quandary of what it means to have a true self is be yourself, right? Because what that means is don't act, basically. Someone might say to that, well, my true self is acting. To be myself is to be an actor. And so what the phrase be yourself implies basically is that acting is not a way to be a real person, and that everyone in being themselves will drop all pretenses and just be a sort of raw, authentic version of themselves. And maybe the issue with that is that you never know what part of you is acting and what part of you is original you.
Right. When we're talking about this, the true self, I was reminded about in Japan, they have this idea of hone and tatemae. And tatemae is sort of the face you present to the world. And the idea is that consensus is desirable. So the self you present to the world is someone who doesn't disagree, someone who fits in, somebody who wants to be considerate of everybody else's opinions. And so it's very important the way almost not to have opinions, because if you do, that might upset the consensus. And the hone, I think, is the true self, which you would show to your friends or to your family. And I guess probably a layer below that is, I can't remember where I came across it, but this idea of the secret self, which is, the side of yourself that you don't show to anyone. And I thought that was quite true. But I also, there was a thing in the All About Eve where she says something like, "Oh, you're Margot," And she says, "Oh, well, I wish I knew what that meant. I wish I knew who I was." And
I wish someone would tell me about me.
Yes, exactly. And there's a Scottish line or something like, "Would some power the gift give us to see ourselves as others see us?" And this idea that you don't know what face you're presenting to the world. And I think that's very true. And also, I don't know from 1 minute to the next exactly what I'm going to say. I don't know how I'm going to finish this sentence. So there's a sense that I can't even see inside my own brain in any meaningful sense. So I don't quite know what exactly we mean by the true self, because I certainly don't know what my true self is. Maybe you kind of learn what your true self is when you come up against real adversity, and then suddenly you discover, there's a film, I'm sure you've seen it, where there's a avalanche, and the avalanche comes thundering down the mountain, and it gets closer and closer, and gradually they realize it's going to hit them.
Yeah.
And I think the wife grabs the kids, and the husband flees for his life, ignoring his wife and family. And I guess at that moment, it's not just that they see the real him, but he finds out the real him, which until then was kind of concealed from him.
Well, I think the way this shows up in close-up is that you're presented with a clear dichotomy between real and fake for most of the movie. So you have this guy, and the real version of him is this, just poor guy who's looking for work and has a wife and kids. And then the fake version of him is, this director that he's playing, that he's pretending to be. And for most of the movie, this is how we see it, that when he's speaking to the judge in this kind of like wounded, sensitive way, that's his real self coming out, is when he's saying, "Oh, I made a mistake. I'm sorry." And this is called into question when one of the brothers of the family claims that he's really just acting in court as well. And that the version of him where he's playing this poor downtrodden guy who just wanted to live his dreams, and film saved his life, and so he just wants to emulate them. That too is cultivated personality that he's just using to trick the judge as he tricked the family. And so really, and even in this ending scene where he's crying and really bearing his soul, we don't know, that too is in front of a camera in reality. And so we don't know how much of that is real. And so it calls into question the ability of human beings to be real, I think.
I think one really interesting, almost like hypothesis that All About Eve seems to put forward about that is that the reality is always what somebody else has. So that in All About Eve, also there's this sort of naive character, supposedly, right, of Eve, and then there's the actress who is glamorous Margot, right? And Eve wants to be Margot, right? And Eve looks up to Margot. And so Eve sees being Margot as being real in some way, being someone, right? But Margot sees Eve the same way, right? The original Eve, what's appealing about her, she's so fresh and innocent and unspoiled and real, right? And at the end of the movie, you have that just repeats with another person who's fresh and innocent and unspoiled, right? And the Eve has now become Margot, right? And she's now jaded and looks at this girl, right? So there's this thought that your real self is always outside you. It's always the you that you're not.
Right, except that I don't think that's quite right, because I don't think Eve is ever innocent, right? She's always the serpent. She's not Eve, yeah, right. She's the serpent, right? From the very beginning. But as she's presented to us, she's this innocent woman who wants to become, Margot, who looks up to her, but really she's looking to supplant her or to use her and to get on herself.
And one interesting thing about that is that it's never clear how genuine it is and how much it's just like avarice, basically, because, there's that scene where she is wearing her dress or putting her dress on, and Margot comes and she's embarrassed, and at that point in the movie leads us to think that, oh, she's just this really idealistic, she really idolizes her. And then once we learn later, we're tempted to say, oh no, the whole time it was all calculated. She was all just, trying to trick. She didn't actually care about Margot at all. But I think a more complex reading of the movie is that she was, greedy and selfish, but she was also genuinely did look up to Margot. And so, she kind of has these two things in her at once. And just as there's no clear real identity in close-up, there's no clear real identity of who she is and what she wants.
Yeah, I'm inclined to take a slightly different reading, like that Eve is not a serpent. So in the scene where what's the guy's name who exposes her? The newspaper guy?
George Sanders, DeWitt.
Addison DeWitt.
Addison DeWitt, yeah. That's right. So where he's like, I know who you really are, like you were this barmaid, whatever. And then she's like crying on the bed and she's like, well, I had to find some way in, right? Like she was, she came from a background where being a movie star was this incredibly attractive, ideal life, right? And that wasn't false that she was representing herself that way, right? And the sort of the real fundamental difference between her and Margot is like whether she has a starry-eyed view of being a star or whether she finds she's jaded and she doesn't care and she doesn't even want to go to the party, etc. And that transformation is the transformation into a star, right? So like it's almost like she had to present a version of her own naivete and innocence that was consumable by Margot, right? And that version was the war hero husband. But like the truth of it is that it's almost inescapable that that person will be innocent, just as the girl at the end is innocent, right? They're innocent in just not having and not being the star. That is a kind of innocence.
But we already know that the girl who comes to visit her at the end, and it's too late, and I'll say it, I'll put on an introduction, but it's spoilers all the way down, right? So, so apologies for that. But at the end, Eve says, "Oh, who was that at the door?" And she says, "Oh, it was the taxi driver." So already she's lying.
Yeah, it's true.
Right. And one interesting thing about Margot, you were talking about like that there's these two things, like being jaded and not caring, and then like really idolizing the position of being a star. But the thing is, it's not that Margot doesn't care about being a star. That's her entire motivation for the movie, is wanting to hold on to being a star. But you're right that when she's introduced, it's almost like, oh yeah, this routine, I'm just coming back in my dressing room, just the day-to-day. And so it's like she, while she has it, she doesn't appreciate it, and she has to act like, oh yeah, this is just the life of a star. But when she starts to lose it, she becomes really desperate, and she almost like starts to be like Eve, in the sense that she is similarly, she has to actually try to be a star, rather than it doesn't just come to her, it doesn't fall into her lap.
I think that's quite interesting as well. The slight twist in the movie is that Margot is quite a feminist movie, certainly in the sense that all the main characters and all the interesting characters are women. I suppose Addison DeWitt is the only strong male characters. The others are pretty much clothes horses.
Kind of look the same and act the same.
Yeah, they're not terribly interesting at all, whereas certainly Eve and Margot and maybe to a lesser extent Karen drive the film. And there's a small part for, I don't know what you would call her, the dresser, or who's absolutely terrific. But it really is a woman's film. But then you have this rather bizarre idea that she suddenly realizes that all she really wants to be is a wife, and this is what will complete her as a woman, which is quite a strange swerve in the movie, particularly as, oh, what does it mean to be a wife? What does it mean to be a woman? And there's no children in the whole film.
Right.
So that just seems very bizarre. Is that if the film is trying to push the idea that what should a woman be? Well, you shouldn't be looking for fame and glory and celebrity. You should actually be looking to become a true woman, to become a wife, and then not a child to be seen. So one wonders whether they really had their heart in that particular plot twist.
Or you could see that as her defeat. Like, she accepts that she's old, and that, I mean, she's not old, but that she's, not young, and that she, is no longer the star that she once was, or something like that. And that she's kind of just embracing the social role, the changes in her social status, not happily embracing them, but somewhat in denial. Like, I guess this is what's meant for me.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I almost feel like the wife thing, the fact that it's wife may not be so important. It's somehow like she grows up, like she becomes like a real person, right? Where it's like there's this constant striving where the next thing is always the thing that's going to prove who you actually are. And it's almost like she like exits the rat race, right? And that it's almost like the movie didn't have the resources for talking to us about what it would be to graduate to being a real person, right? That's sort of what she's saying. Like, and so it uses the idea of wife, but I think you're right. It's like, that's not thought through.
If you see that as becoming a real person, then the scene towards the end in which Addison DeWitt says, "I own you now," is her becoming a fake person, because it's not a real relationship, but he's saying, you know, what you're entering is a world of artificiality, and in which the relationship is me owning you because if you want to be successful, you have to be in a relationship with me, and that kind of thing.
And yet it's quite interesting that he says that "I own you," which I guess he does, and you can't marry whoever it was she was, you know, the director that she was planning to marry. But you never see them in any kind of romantic pose or this. What does he mean by "I own you now"? Because I assumed it meant romantically, but it's clear that they're not living together.
Maybe it was just a Hays Code and they couldn't get more racy than that. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the very last thing that Margot says, it's like she has the statue at Eve, and she's like, "That is, put that where your heart should be," or something.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, and I feel like that's Margot being like, "I'm now a grown up, like I have a heart, there's like a reality to me, whereas you're just a shadow of a person."
So in a way, she's renouncing her former self.
Yes.
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah, she's grown. Because she does behave throughout the film as a spoiled child, right?
Abe had a great point about that, though. We were talking about it last night, and Abe was like, Margot keeps freaking out and like being paranoid, but everything she's paranoid about is actually true. And like this woman is trying to get her husband, and she is trying to replace her.
There was a conspiracy to puncture her tire, so she...
Right. It's like every moment when she freaks out and is like lashes out at everyone, she seems irrational, but she's actually correct.
I found the film quite hard to watch for that very reason, because there's a particular style of film that I just hate, where the protagonist that I'm identifying with can see something and understand something, and nobody else in the film can see it. And it just causes me to stress out totally, because I put myself in their position. I think that is just the worst position to be in.
In a way, yeah. But in a way, it's not that the other characters can see it. Can't see it, rather. It's that they can see it, but they just think she should accept it. Like, they can see that Eve is becoming successful, that, they can see that she's younger, all that stuff. But they're just like, stop complaining, basically. Like, this is just the way the world is. Like, you're not young anymore. You don't get to, like, demand to be a star.
No, I think Eve she could see the fin and at one stage, and nobody else could, because Birdie or whatever it was drew her attention to it. And I thought maybe there was a bit of a parallel with Parasite, where it seems like the upper classes have difficulty seeing when they're being tricked. And it's kind of the lower class character, is much less sentimental, much less, high flowing view of the world, and can immediately see through Eve right from the very start, and she's pretty much the only one who does.
Except the difference is, and spoilers for Parasite here, All About Eve is about how the person through trickery is able to successfully take the place of the upper class character, but Parasite is not about that.
No, it's not. But I thought it was interesting that the upper class just were completely unable to see. Again, I found Parasite caused me huge anxiety, because I sympathize with the upper class people much more than I did sympathize with the lower class people, who I just thought were absolutely horrible. And yet I felt the filmmaker was setting it up for us to root for them. And I was thinking, no, they're terrible, terrible people.
I agree with you that Parasite is like, there's this interesting essay that was about how Parasite is actually this like conservative screed about how like poor people are these lazy, like whatever, and rich people are so kind. And I think there's like something to that, but I actually think it's unintentional. Like, I think when Bong Joon-ho made it, he did intend for them to be equally dislikable, or unlikable rather. And yet I don't know what this indicates, but I think when he made it, he ended up actually not assigning much wrongdoing to the rich family and assigning a ton of wrongdoing to the poor family. But then, of course, for everybody reads it, including the media and the critics as a sort of pro-revolution, left-wing populist movie.
Which I get. Yes, I think I know the review. That's from Marginal Revolution, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was Alex Tabrock.
Oh, I just had a thought, by the way. So a connection. So you were talking about how there's that scene where Margot decides to get married and basically become like a mature woman and like stop, trying to cling to the spotlight. And it kind of reminds me of the scene in Persona when I forget their names, but Liv Ullmann's character is being
Elizabeth Vogler.
Elizabeth Vogler. When you learn about her experience having a child, and it's kind of similar because she's also an actress, and she also is in a way like doesn't like the idea initially of like sort of settling down and having a kid. And we hear this long monologue about how she looked,
she went to a party.
Yeah, someone told her, they didn't think she would be a good mother, and then she hated her child, and she almost, I think, wanted to kill it. And so there's this like similar thing where this woman is like faced with the omen of actually, in a way, like growing up by marrying and having kids.
It's slightly embarrassing because you've just shot my argument about Persona.
Oh, what was your argument? Tell us, because we are both Persona is the movie we felt most uncertain about.
Well, I'd forgotten. I thought it was all a red herring, but you just sort of killed that, because I thought they make out that it's a film about the actress, but she says nothing throughout the film. But now you're telling me she did say something.
Oh no, she didn't. Alma, that whole scene, it happens twice.
Right.
So, and Abe, you were the one who pointed out to me that it was actually the nurse.
I think so.
Speaking in one, you see it.
Yeah, but you're right. She's being told about her own experience.
She doesn't speak.
Right.
The only word she says in the movie is like "don't" when she's about to spill the boiling water.
And then at the end, she says nothing.
Oh yeah, nothing. Yeah.
Right. So my take on it was that, well, who knows what it was about, but I felt that the character of the nurse was effectively being psychoanalyzed throughout the film. And I don't really know very much about psychoanalysis, but I think one of the ideas traditionally is that the psychoanalyst doesn't really say anything. They just say, oh, do say some more, please explain. So I felt that the nurse on the face of it is there to help the actress. But that's not what happens at all. It's the nurse who, through talking and discussing her own problems and her own inner life and her own psychology, she's the one who at the end has sort of gone through a crisis and come out the end, and you see her leaving, and whatever, perhaps she's a better person, or perhaps she's a, more healthy person. I don't quite know, but I just feel she's been through a psychoanalytical session throughout the entire film.
Yeah, I was going to say one bit of evidence that corroborates that is that I believe this is true, that Carl Jung, who's probably like the father or one of the fathers of psychoanalysis, I think, he distinguished between the soul and the persona. So in some sense, what we were talking about, the true self and the fake self. And I think the word for soul in his writing is Alma. And so that's not my discovery, but I think that what that may indicate is that one reading of it could be that Alma is Alma and Elizabeth Vogler is her persona, or in some sense a version of her, but that Alma is the real person and there's only one person in the movie.
Yes, and you do see something to that effect when their two faces merge at one stage.
And there's even a scene in which Alma becomes Elizabeth and meets her husband. And I thought that was going to be the end of the movie, but then it turned out it reverted back. So I was a bit confused.
It was a very confusing scene, I thought. I thought there were sort of two standout scenes in Persona, and one was where she's discussing where they have sex on the beach, which I've read a couple of reviews, and they talk about it being an orgy, and I'm just thinking, I'm not sure. Do 4 people count as an orgy? What's the cutoff?
Minimum number.
Maybe when these films
it's described within the movie as an orgy, though.
Is it?
Yeah,
I forgot that. I forgot that.
Letter, she just.
Oh yeah, you're right.
Elizabeth describes it that way.
Okay, fair enough. Then that's what it was. And then the other scene, which I thought was the standout scene actually in the whole film is where she drops the glass, and the other character's walking to and fro, and she doesn't warn her. And you got the tension building up and tension building up. And I just thought, yeah, that's so realistic. This sort of, I'm not to blame if she walks in it, but it's just an act of pure spite, which I thought was terribly acute about how people are cruel to each other.
Well, one question I had is, what did the opening mean? Because I don't need an analysis of all the little images that are shown, but specifically the boy on the bed and then reaching up to the screen of the woman. That's what I was curious about, because it clearly has some meaning.
Well, my theory answered that easily, because it's simply showing us the inside of the nurse's psyche. So we're just being given sort of some raw Jungian images. That's my cop-out theory.
It could even be something about motherhood, I guess. Like if he's the son and the image and the woman that he's reaching toward is the mother. And the mother kind of engulfs the son in that image.
Yeah, it was very bizarre, and you weren't sure whether the person was meant to be dead or not. It was quite unsettling from that point of view.
But I do feel like it can't be an accident that Bergman. So I think there's something right about the sort of psychoanalytic way of thinking about that relationship, and the idea of transference seems to be there, where it's like the analyst, i.e., Elizabeth, not speaking, right, allows Alma to sort of like transfer herself onto her and make them feel like they're one, like they're so close, right? And I think the letter, there's something so interesting about the letter, because it addresses this fantasy that every psychoanalytic patient has to find out, like, what does your analyst really think about you, right? Like, what are they secretly writing? And like this idea that she's studying her, right?
That's a good point, because when she reads it, she's thinking like, we had this really deep connection. I was telling her my darkest secrets, and she was understanding them. And then she reads this letter, and I think the letter really supports the psychoanalytic reading of the movie, because it's like, oh, what an interesting patient. She talks about all these weird, cheating on her husband. And it's kind of this slightly dismissive, like, summary of her life that makes her feel like all the stuff that she said was kind of like this. It's like a Wikipedia article that she's reading or something.
Right, yeah, and so she's kind of saying, oh, but I thought we were friends.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm agreeing with the interpretation, but I also feel like something that Bergman is sort of doing with that is saying, not that like this is a case of psychoanalysis, but that somehow psychoanalytic relations are embedded in everyday relations in a weird way, right? So that like having Elizabeth be an actress, right? And having this sort of start out with, there's a kind of transference that happens with movie stars, right? People sort of project onto and attach to movie stars, right? And they partly do it because they see their faces up, like a lot of, we see their faces really close up. And I mean, Bergman always just loves to show Liv Ullmann's face, actually in so many movies, not just in that he loves to show close-ups of her face. But, when you see someone's face really big on a screen, they feel like close to you, because normally you only see like your loved one's face is big, right? That's not like a normal thing in human, like our brains have not adapted to see large faces of strangers, right? So there's this kind of, there's this way in which I think he's, taking that psychoanalytic connection, and then he's sort of doing something with it by having her not be a doctor, but an actress, right? And saying that somehow we are these sort of, something like transference relations just kind of precipitate out of ordinary relationships. Or non-ordinary ones.
Sorry, I don't know if this is a strong segue, but in a way, Close Up is a movie about psychoanalysis as well. And you were saying that we have psychoanalytic relationships with a lot of people in our lives. And unexpectedly, there's kind of everyone is trying to psychoanalyze the main character of Close Up. Like, the movie is not mostly about whether he's a criminal. Like, he keeps saying, whenever he says, no, I wasn't trying to rob them, I promise, the judge says, it doesn't matter, stop talking about that, we're not accusing you of that. And what they really want to know is why he did it, right? They ask him that like 5 times, like, no, but you haven't answered, why did you do it? And so, in a way, it's a court scene, and the other judges ask that as well. And so, but it's really a movie about trying to understand why he did it. And then what I found so interesting, and I said this after we finished watching the movie, is that he's very adept at psychoanalyzing himself, and he's very he does it. Like he's not like, oh, I don't know, I'm just like a poor, simple workman. You have to figure my soul out for me. He's like, oh no, like I have this list of things. Like his movies like explain my suffering, and so then I felt like I was him, and like I felt like, you know, I could be someone real if I were pretending to be him. And it's this weird thing where this guy almost seems to have a ready-made self-psychoanalysis of why he was doing this, and it makes the whole thing less believable, because it's like if it's so easy for you to give this story about why you conned this family, then are you really telling the truth, or are you just inventing another character?
I've got a couple of things I wanted to say. One is, I think the reason he does that is that he was given these lines to speak by the director. So I think some of the stuff that we see is for real, and some of it is, please say these lines that I've written for you, which he does, I think, even in the trial, which I think was written, which wasn't a written scene. I mean, this is actually the trial taking place.
No, I disagree. I don't think it's the trial taking place. I think it's a recreation of the trial, right?
I don't think so. I think he was given permission to film at the trial, but you may be right. I'm not completely sure about that, but I know, well, I don't know actually. I thought that was the actual trial taking place.
No, it's not.
But maybe not.
It's
I know some bits are reconstructed. For example, the scene where he's talking to the family before he's arrested.
Right.
I know that that's a reconstruction. Well, it has to be a reconstruction because the camera doesn't make sense. The camera angles don't make sense otherwise.
Oh my God.
But I think
you're right. I was wrong. You're right. I saw this movie in early spring, and it went on my list of favorite movies, and yet I didn't have any idea what was going on. Yeah, no, you're right. So a bunch of it was constructed, but the court scene is not. That's really interesting. That changes my whole view of it.
Okay, well, let me give you another thought, which may or may not be true, because I was watching it, because I'm a lawyer, so I was kind of watching it as a lawyer. And I was quite interested in a few things there. One is, right at the start, the judge says to the family, do you want to proceed? You can withdraw your claim if you want to, or you can withdraw the case if you want to. And he said, once we go ahead, that's it, you won't be able to withdraw. And I thought, well, that's quite an odd thing to say, because it's a criminal case, right? So in the US or in the UK, you couldn't do that. But then I remembered reading David Friedman's book, and I chatted to David Friedman a few weeks back, and he has this really good book called Legal Systems Very Different from Ours. And he talks about various forms of sort of self-help law where the state is quite weak. And so the reason for that probably is that what they say is you can do a deal with the defendant. So he'll pay you some sum of money, which will make you feel happy with the result. And he will have been punished, and the state doesn't need to be involved. So it's kind of a form of civil compensation. So it's quite a neat way of compensating the family. And then, but once the case gets going, well, that's it. The state takes over. And now it's the state's case, and it's no longer the family's case. So it kind of moves from being a private matter to being a public matter. And then when he says, oh, don't worry about the robbery, that's not what you're charged with. I think the reason for that is that if it was a robbery or if it was something like that, it would be a different type of case. It would have been a state case from the start, and it would have been tried according to, it would have had different punishments, and it would have had different rules of evidence, and the family wouldn't have been able to get to be, I mean, I don't know this for a fact, but I think depending on which category your crime falls into, different rules apply. So the judge is actually taking a very legalistic view, because the family are saying, but he was trying to rob us. He was trying to rob us. And the judge is saying, no, that's not what we're talking about here. They may have thought that, and we may take evidence about that and get their views on that, but that's not what you're accused of. Because if you were accused of it, we'd have to be doing things differently. And he doesn't actually say that, but that's sort of what my theory was as to what was maybe going on.
But it's funny that they do that thing, and then at the end, the family once again just gets a chance to essentially withdraw the complaint.
No, they don't get a chance to withdraw the complaint. They get the chance to forgive him. And if they forgive him, then the judge will take that into account in the sentencing.
Yeah. Oh, I see.
And the judge actually gives him the lowest sentence possible, which I think is 1 month in jail or something like that. I think I picked that up from somewhere.
I see.
And actually, going back to David Friedman's book, that's very much how English justice worked back in the 18th century, where prosecutions had to be brought privately. And people would actually, it was like shopkeepers and merchants would actually join a sort of a confederation, to club together money to be able to prosecute cases, so that you knew that if you tried to rob them, whatever, that, they would actually take the trouble to track you down and bring you to court. So it was kind of a form of, sort of private police force.
In the ancient world, like in ancient Greece, that was just how murder worked. Like your family would bring a suit against the murderer.
So I have a question. For y'all to explain to me something about close-up. My question is, given what we've been talking about real and fake and personal identity, why is he crying at the end? What prompts that reaction?
You mean when he meets?
Yeah,
when he meets Makhmalbaf.
Well, I think he's genuinely upset by what he did. And so I think he's genuinely emotional about the whole thing. Or maybe he expects that he's supposed to be emotional about the whole thing, sort of talking about sort of this ancient forms of justice. It was certainly the case that when the Romans were brought to court, they were expected to put on sort of their most ragged clothes and, weep and cry, carry on.
In a way, I agree with you that the reason he's crying is that he feels guilt, but I think it's more complicated. I think it's that when he sees the fake version of himself, he only is able to realize what he did. Because throughout the whole thing, while he admits that what he did was wrong, he kind of says, I never meant to trick them, which is a weird thing for him to say, right? Because he was explicitly tricking them. And he says, I didn't intend to let it go very far. He says, I really felt like him. And so these things kind of add up, so that his picture of himself is that he was sort of like just basically acting normally, and things got a little out of hand. And then when he sees the real Makhmalbaf, he sees how they saw him, and he realizes how much of a lie he was telling. And so it's almost like he only realizes that there is a distinction between real and fake self once he sees the fake self.
I felt it was interesting that they then got the real director that he was impersonating to come and meet him.
Right.
And this is a really simple guy, right, who's living in his fantasy world, and he's just spent a month in prison, and now he's meeting this guy, his hero. I mean, I guess, or his hero, but this person that he's enjoyed impersonating, stepping into his shoes. I guess that would be pretty overwhelming for him.
And also, I think there's an aspect of shame that the circumstances under which he's meeting him are that he's this con man criminal who has to go apologize to this family. And the guy's like, those are dumb flowers, get better ones, like dry your tears, you look like a child, like, and he's kind of like, he's not able to like face him like a man, and so that in itself just adds to the overwhelming aspect of meeting him.
Maybe it's like one way to read the movie is, there's the scene where a celebrity meets their fan, right? And you see that scene happen in All About Eve, right? And imagine, and there's this great distance between the fan and the celebrity, right? Try to construct a scenario that will make that distance as great as possible. And you get close up. Close up, the whole movie is just like, because you have here this guy who's pretended to be this other guy. He's this poor, like, nobody, and he's just gone to jail, right? And he comes out of jail, and there's this person. It's like, there couldn't be a greater distance between these two people.
Oh, wait, what do you mean distance?
What I mean is like, it is like the fan, when they meet the celebrity, right, they're going to be starstruck. They're going to be like, oh, I shouldn't be in the same space as you, right? Like Eve is when she first meets Margot. And that's the, like, I don't know, I once sat next to, now I'm not remembering which
Matt Damon?
Matt Damon, yeah, Matt Damon. Okay, I once sat next to Matt
my goodness.
Damon, like a coffee shop, and I was like, oh my God, I'm next to Matt Damon. I was very close to him, and I kept trying to move my arm just so I could touch him. Probably legally assault, right? Yeah. And
but you're not a fan.
Exactly. I'm not a fan. I'm not like, he's not like, I haven't like seen all his movies, right? But I was kind of starstruck, right? Now imagine how much more, so there was a distance between me and Matt Damon. I was like super curious what he was eating, and now imagine that like I'd been this huge fan of Matt Damon. That would have meant so much more. That distance would be greater. Now imagine that I'd been impersonating Matt Damon. Now imagine that I'd just gone to jail impersonating Matt Damon, right? And so it's like it's like there's this, there's this distance, there's this gulf between the fan and the celebrity, and like close up kind of kind of blows that open like as far as you possibly could, and then gives us this moment of like, what would it be to cross that gulf, right? And it's just like this bowing, shameful, like overwhelming.
So I'm going to try to do an acrobatics and tie all three together.
Okay.
You were just saying that when you saw Matt Damon, it was like you were like in awe and you like wanted to touch him, right? And similarly, this is like how Sabzian reacts to seeing Makhmalbaf is like as if he were a god, like And then there's this scene in All About Eve where I believe Addison DeWitt or one of the men says, someone says, theater isn't, I forget what they say, but something along the lines of like, theater is just a day's work. It's just a job like anything else. We're just doing our best, whatever. And then he's like, no, this isn't true. Like we're gods among men. Like we're different from everybody else. Like we are the cream of the crop of civilization. And so we get this picture of not Margot, but just the culture of the theater as that I don't know if Joseph Mankiewicz, who wrote the movie, was in the world of the theater, but so I don't know if it's accurate, but that they see themselves as like better than everyone else. And then the final thing that I was going to tie it to is how I noticed this thing in Persona where Liv Ullmann's character could be read as God, and I looked it up, and other people have read it this way, that she's like confessing her sins basically to God. And Bergman talked about the silence, or not talked about, but portrayed the silence of God a lot in his movies. And so that's why she's silent. And she's like, God is like judging her. It's almost like Judgment Day or something. And so she's saying all the bad stuff she's done. And then in that scene in which we learn about how she had this very negative reaction to seeing her child. It's like God's negative reaction at seeing humanity when he floods the world. And this is also his attitude by the fact that she sees various atrocities throughout the movie, including the Holocaust and this monk burning himself, and has a very negative reaction to that as well. So that could be seen as the same thing as, so if you see her as God, as representing God, then you could see that as her looking upon mankind and being scared by her own creation. In any case, I'm just trying to find a thread of like celebrities being God.
Well, okay, I'll top that because Agnes, you've appeared on the Eric Weinstein podcast and on the Tyler Cohen podcast. Mm-hmm. So you're becoming a celebrity in your own right. Have you any insight from that side of the mirror?
What it's like to be God.
What it's like to be God, yeah.
Yeah, I think that...
Have you ever had a fan interaction like the one in Close Up?
I get fan emails.
Okay.
I think that I do have a worry that like I'm going to start performing. And then I get sort of people asking me questions and feeling like I should know the answer to this. So like it's like staying, and I think as a philosopher, in a way you can answer any question, but also no questions, but like staying philosophical in a way about things that people ask me, which is to say there's like a very restricted way that you can answer questions as a philosopher. Like you're probably not going to give people what they wanted from you if you give them a philosophical answer. So
you're afraid of, like, in a way, playing yourself.
Yeah, well, no, I'm actually, like I want to play myself. I'm afraid of playing not myself.
No, like playing yourself, like playing a character of yourself. That is how other people see you. Like, I don't know, what were the names of those two in you were saying in Japanese?
Yeah, the tatemae. Tatemae is the front. Tatemae means standing in front. So, and honne is the real inside self that you share with other people.
So is it that you're afraid of portraying the outward version of yourself rather than just being the inward version?
You know what it's a lot like? Actually, the danger, the temptation, whatever, it's actually, I'm very familiar with it. It's a lot like being a teacher and students coming to you, and on some level they're wanting to be your friend, and you have to stay the teacher.
Yeah.
And so it's like staying the philosopher is a little bit like that. It's like, you know, there's a certain kind of answer you want from me, and it's not that I'm deliberately not giving it to you. in the sense of withholding something. It might be experienced by the person as withholding, but it's more like, remembering who I am, like remembering there's a kind of gravitational pull of what the other person wants you to be or how they want to represent you. And I guess that would be like, it's playing someone, but it's not playing me. It's playing something like playing into a certain kind of expectation, as opposed to always at every point sort of forcing them to challenge that expectation.
Yeah.
So I was just trying to think like, so what we're talking about now is like ethics and how you should be if people look up to you. So I'm thinking like going beyond just analysis of symbols or plot points in these movies, is there a moral message to any of them? Can we condense any of these movies into, or all of these movies into like a one sentence dictum on how to live your life?
Well, okay, let me just totally ignore that and ask you this question, which is not completely unconnected. Who did you like best in Close Up? Or no, let me just ask you, not who did you like best, but did you like any of the characters? Did you like any of the characters better than any of the others? Because I have a view on that.
See, I kind of like all of them. I think everyone in the movie is pretty, like the family is definitely not, they're definitely very honorable and kind. Like they never are interested in getting money from him or seeing him punished. They just want him to admit what he did wrong, and they want to make sure that he's not going to do it to anyone else.
I love when the mom says, "Let him finish his food."
Yeah, and they're not, and at the end they forget it.
But that's a reconstructed scene,
right?
So is that her or is that her persona?
True. But so I was just going to say, like, at least as far as what's in the movie, I can't say what's real or what's not real, but as far as what's in the movie, I like the family, but I also like him because, you know, he's very easy to identify with and to understand. And the judge is pretty acrimonious. He's not at all like biased or mean. So I don't think there's any bad person in the movie. Whereas in All About Eve, Eve is clearly a bad person.
Yes, it's not that I didn't like the family. I just wasn't hugely impressed by them. And I guess what you said, it's very easy to identify with Sabzian is what I felt. You know, I wanted to put my arm around him. It's not so bad.
But isn't that interesting, given that they were just a family trying to go about their lives? He exploited them.
I don't think so. So I agree with you, Russ, about the family. I think that the family and him, in a way, indulged in the same fantasy, right? They indulged in this fantasy that we're like fancy movie people. Now, in his case, he was sort of helping them do that fantasy through lying, and they weren't lying. But in a way, they their dream, right, was similar to his dream. And it was just like he got punished for it and they don't. And they weren't just being a regular family. They were like being a regular family that was indulging in this image of being like, you know, in the movie that they had no real conception of, right? And like they wanted to be, you know, movie people or something.
So he was maybe being more honest in his dishonesty.
I'm a little more critical of him than you are, because he clearly, there's a really interesting moment in the movie where he's kind of looking down and he's thinking to himself and he's talking and he's saying, you know, they would have done anything I asked. They would have moved a heavy dresser if I asked them to. They would have cut down the tree in their front yard. And the judge says, you were going to make them cut down their tree. And he says, no, I wouldn't have let it get that far. And to me, this was like, in a sense, I don't know how much of it is acting, but that seemed to me like there was a little smile on his face. And it seemed to me like he was kind of laughing to himself at how stupid this family is, that they would like, or at least, I don't know about laughing at them, but he was relishing the power that for a moment he had over them. And they were never doing that to him. They may have been indulging in some sense in the same fantasy, but they were never trying to manipulate him. And he was really, you know, he really liked the feeling of controlling them because of the celebrity that he had in that moment.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that was an interesting bit of the film. I agree. And again, I suspect he's quoting lines that he was given, but maybe not. Maybe that was what he was really thinking. I don't know. That's one of the problems with these docudramas, is that you don't quite know what's real and what's fake.
The easiest message to take away is like, oh, the point is that it doesn't matter what's real. That's what people often say with things like this, but I don't think that's the point of Close Up. But the easiest message to take away, because it doesn't require any further analysis, is like, oh, it's just about how like nothing is real, and like, you should just embrace like being fake or something like that.
So I don't agree with that, but I actually do think that the movie has this, that part of the effect or the force of the movie is the viewer constantly wondering whether the person is acting or not, right? And that like we are looking for the real Sabzian, right? Like we're searching for him with our eyes. We're like, wait, is that a line or is that right? And that like that's something that's sort of brilliant about the movie, is that it implicates the viewer in this quest for the real person, right? That like so many of the characters are part of in all of these movies, but like the viewer is part of it in this movie. I think it's right that it's not, the moral isn't like it doesn't matter. It does matter. Like you feel it mattering. You're like, wait, did this, like the thing with you and the court scene, right? It really matters to you whether that was part of, whether that was acting or not.
Yeah, right.
So that it should matter to you. But it's like you're on this sort of quest.
But see, I wanted to go a little bit more into like this idea of the celebrity as God, because I don't know, I'm interested in that idea also just in real life. Like it seems so strange to me that you would like meet this guy, Matt Damon, who like you're not interested in. You would never go see one of his movies unless you had some prior reason to. You don't like have some big crush on him. He's not like, he's not like particularly weird looking or anything. And yet he's like this, you're like, oh, there's actual skin and like body, and like I can't believe. So it's like, he came down from heaven to like talk to us mere mortals. And it's like, why do we subject ourselves to that?
In London, we get quite a few, stage stars and film stars around, and every so often you'll find yourself in the same restaurant. And everybody is like, I'm not looking, and sort of extravagantly ignoring them. And yet, I can't speak for everybody else, but I'm sitting there super conscious of the fact that I'm doing the right thing by not making any eye contact. And what is this power that these people have? Because when they're on stage, they're hugely impressive. They're speaking their lines, and somehow they're bigger than they are, than anybody could be in real life. They sort of grow into this much bigger thing. And then once the lights are out and you see them in the real life, they're just smaller, not so big.
But they don't seem that way to us. We don't see them and we're like, oh, he's really just a normal person. We see him and we're like, there he is, in his full glory.
It's true.
And also we care a ton about their personal lives. I mean, I don't, but like there's this huge market for tabloids and paparazzi, and like why that as well? Like why do we select this? It doesn't really matter that they're actors, right? Like they could be anything. The point is, it's like the Truman Show. The point is we just have selected these people, and we've decided that those are the people for whom anything they do is going to really matter, and we really care about them. And like, why? How does that benefit us psychologically? Because it has to. We'd have to have a reason for doing it.
Yeah, Matt Damon was eating tuna fish in a bowl. So he had a bowl, and it was just scoops of tuna salad with no bread, nothing. Okay, I will remember that until the day I die. Right? What is he eating? I was fascinated by this weird food choice that was not on the menu. Why doesn't he have a tuna sandwich? Why is he just eating scoops of tuna in a bowl? How gross, But anyway, that'll be examples. Like, why am I interested, right? I don't think actors are particularly interesting people. I meet lots of actually interesting people, like who have really interesting thoughts. I can have great conversations with them. They've written books that I'm interested in. Like, I have the opportunity to meet people who are actually interesting, right? And so but then I meet like Matt Damon, who I don't find interesting. Like, I'm not interested to have a conversation with him. There's nothing about him. And and I wouldn't care with the interesting people what they had for lunch, right? But with Matt Damon, I'm like, I care what he had for lunch. So
I saw a headline that said, coronavirus has taken its toll on James Corden. And it's like, I don't know, but I'm asking you actually, like, do you guys have an explanation for this?
Okay, wait, I have an explanation, which is that your God theory is true, and we see these people as gods, and then we find it bizarre that they eat, that they have marriages and divorces and have to go through coronavirus because they're supposed to be gods and they're supposed to be like invincible.
But why? Why do we need gods in that way? Maybe it's, this is kind of an interesting theory, but maybe it's like, now that we are monotheists, we need the Greek gods in some way in our lives. And so we've resurrected them in the form of celebrities.
I think that's quite an interesting idea, because they are very much like Greek gods, because they can do all sorts of bad things, just like the Greek gods could do all sorts of bad things.
Right.
And they're beautiful.
And they have beef. If you hear, oh, Angelina is suing Brad, or in hip hop, which is the world in which I'm know more about, there's like literally they sometimes kill each other. Like they have these rivalries, and everybody cares so much. One of them drops a diss track, the other one drops a diss track, and it's very similar to the Titans and the Olympians or something along those lines.
But if you go back to the old days of Hollywood, I guess they were more godlike then, right? Because they were held up as these paragons, and their image was carefully controlled in a way which perhaps it isn't now. And yet I was sort of doing this for Wikipedia, and my goodness, everybody seemed to be marrying everybody else. I don't think any character that I researched had less than 4 divorces. And Bergman, he had a child with I can't remember, Ullman, is it?
Yes.
He had an affair with what's her name, Anderson.
Yeah.
And pretty much every other woman in the whole of the Nordic area, as best I can tell. It was just unbelievable. And then Bette Davis, I don't know how many times she married, but a ton of times, including falling in love with her co-star on the set of All About Eve.
Which co-star?
I think the one that I think Bill, the one who played her husband.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
Yeah.
And then argued solidly for the next 10 years before divorcing.
So strange.
But yeah, the private lives back then, we think that, Johnny Depp, but these guys could show Johnny Depp a thing or two, as best I can tell. It's quite surprising. And then you were trying to connect all 3 films, and I couldn't do that, but I was looking at George Sanders, who I thought, gosh, he's got a very English accent. And then, of course, I discovered that he is English, and he's a very famous English actor, so it makes sense because, of course, the English are always the villains in Hollywood films. So he was quite interesting in that he then, after All About Eve, he starred in an Italian film by Rossellini.
Yeah, A Journey to Italy.
Yeah, and apparently that was sort of a gateway film to the new wave. So I guess kind of a gateway film to films like Persona.
Yeah, A Journey to Italy is very conventional in terms of filmmaking style, but in subject is kind of avant-garde. See what you're saying about it being a gateway to art films.
Huh. And then he had an absolutely miserable sort of personal life, and he ended up, I think he married about 4 times, I don't know. But anyway, he ended up committing suicide, which, really quite shocked me. It seems like he had a fairly miserable last sort of 10 years of his life. And actually, I thought he was one of the best characters in All About Eve because, not only was he evil, but he was given all the best lines. Well, I suppose Bette Davis got some pretty good lines, but Addison DeWitt, not too shabby.
It's interesting that she's named Eve because, Eve is this, in the Bible, she's like this character that represents corrupted innocence, of the corrupted innocence of mankind. You have this original purity and then original sin. And so you might wonder whether that is warning about what's going to happen with her, that she becomes corrupted. But then, of course, at the end, it seems to imply that she was always that way, and that she was never, the innocence we saw in the beginning was just artifice.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I guess you can't read too much into it, but I think Eve does sort of imply that there was original sin involved in there somewhere. So I have a question. Maybe the reason we need, tell me if this sounds right, maybe the reason we need celebrities is that they complete us in some way. They are, or somehow that they're the persona to our soul, or just something that they somehow are necessary for our psychology.
I mean, one thing we might say there is it's original sin, right? So if we were really innocent, if we were really naive, if Eve were the Eve that she pretended to be, she had to pretend when she was starting out to not be that interested in becoming an actress, right? To not even, she wouldn't even dream of that. But all of us, it's we are corrupted in that we want this thing and we feel like it would only be in having it that we would be purified, right? So, if there were such a thing as being Eve or being innocent, even for Sabzian, to be the real Sabzian or something, if that were a thing you could be, maybe people could happily just live that way. But actually the naive, innocent, untouched, that there is no such person.
When you were speaking there, it just made me think that maybe the connection that you could make between Close Up and All About Eve is that once you achieve it, there's really nothing there. It's just emptiness behind the screen. You know, there's nothing there for Sabzian. There's nothing there for Eve. You know, her life.
Oh, right. There is a kind of like inevitability to it where he's like, it literally only lasts like 2 days, this period in which he's tricking the family. And he says, maybe he's lying, but he says, I knew the whole last day that they were going to arrest me. And it just seems to immediately fall apart. And so there's this sense that he had this like fleeting joy in being able to do this. But I think one parallel and inverse between All About Eve and Close Up is that I think, like, in a way, Close Up is a movie that is like glorifying in some ways artificiality and lying and acting. And All About Eve is demonizing that, and it's in favor of being honest. And so you can see, like, in Close Up, we are introduced initially to someone we see as a con man, just a cheap trickster, huckster, liar. And then by the end, we see him as, like, we see his pursuit of this dream as really noble. And we see how there's no other way for him to, like, you know, be satisfied in this way. And that, like, maybe he needed to trick this family. It was wrong, but maybe that was the only way to make him happy, because otherwise he's just living this drab life. And so in a way, we see the magic of pretending and acting. And then in All About Eve, it's the opposite. We're introduced to someone innocent in the beginning, and we think that they're innocent, and then we learn about their lies and over the course of the movie. Rather than learning about how their lies were actually good, we learn about how their lies were actually bad. And I think by the end, we really get a sense that, like, Margot, even though she was rude and she was paranoid and very selfish and she lashed out, she was at least honest, and she never lies. And when I forget who, but one of the men compliments her for her acting, she says, "He wasn't exaggerating. I was good." And when Eve is complimented, she says, "Oh, I was terrible. I could never. This is." And so in a way, it's like, I see All About Eve as this movie about how, like, all that stuff of humility and all these pretenses are ultimately just they're on the side of just lying and deception, and being brutally honest is, like, probably the most admirable way to be.
Just a question for you. What do you think about the idea that Sabzian was actually a victim, in that the director, as soon as he gets wind of the case, he stops filming the film he's working on at that moment and rushes over and starts filming this case. And he actually tries to get the judge to change the date of the trial to fit in with the filming schedule. And, you know, there's Sabzian, sort of much more humble man than the rich family that he's got something to do with. You know, the journalist can't wait to pounce on him. The director can't wait to pounce on him because this is a great story for his film. And then the director that he's sort of impersonating, you know, he comes along and then promptly proceeds to lecture Sabzian at great length about what he should and shouldn't be doing. And, you know, Sabzian seems to be getting it from all sides pretty much.
Right. I never thought about this, but in a way, the journalist is Kiarostami. He's satirizing himself, you know, where he's like, I need a camera, I need a tape recorder, and he's like trying to snap pictures, and he's seen as this very vulgar character who's like turning everything into a news story. But that's exactly what Kiarostami's doing by making the movie. Yeah,
in a way, you could think the innocent Sabzian is just the Sabzian that is in Kiarostami's movie. Like the guy who has to play Sabzian is kind of this innocent guy who, like, that's how you get access to, like, he's being sort of taken advantage of by everyone, even as, you know, that's because he played, you know, the role of the director guy.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I can just see kind of waving a little bit out of the picture frame, because we're doing this podcast through some sort of a Skype thing. I can just see somebody waving to say that maybe we've reached the end of our time, and that Agnes and Abe have got other things which they need to do and other places that they need to be. So I'll just finish off by saying thank you very, very much for a fascinating discussion of our three films, which were Persona, Close Up, and All About Eve. and I hope that we can do it again sometime. So once again, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.